Welcome psychology. This is the biological perspective. So in this chapter, we're going to look at how biological events affect behavior. A biological event is anything that happens in your biology. So this could be the functioning of a neuron or lots of systems that are working constantly that we have been able to find out so much more about because of brain imaging technology, such as the MRI and CAT scan. Now, this is a fascinating field, and I often tell students it is a wonderful time to be alive and to study the brain from the biological perspective. You now have more information than what the cutting-edge neurologists had for the better part of psychology's history, to be quite honest with you. You can find a picture of your living brain if you were to have an MRI or a CAT scan, and your neurologist has more information than what Sigmund Freud had about the brain. And that is not an exaggeration. So this is a very cutting-edge field. The brain is still the last frontier of human psychology because it is still perplexing. There's still so much that we don't know. The scientific community, however, has just made great leaps and bounds. Even in my lifetime, I was born in '76 and I'm 43. I consider myself to be young. And I can remember when, in the 80s, a lot of this technology was not available because computers weren't what they are now. So with that, what I'd like to do is to draw your attention to a short video that I have placed for you in your Canvas shell. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start this. I got the sound turned down, and you have access to this. So what I'd like to do then is just maximize this and start. So I describe the brain as three supercomputers. The first would be the cortex. It has 4 lobes: parietal, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the frontal lobe, which is the largest. The second supercomputer I call the cerebellum. And the third supercomputer, the brain stem. Okay, so just to go over that real quick, you have what I call 3 supercomputers, and that's just my terminology. I think it helps us understand the brain because we understand the computer analogy. But this outer wrinkly covering of the cortex, the outer wrinkling of the brain, I call the cortex. The cortex is divided into 4 lobes. You will need to know that for a test. The first supercomputer is the cerebral cortex. It is responsible for higher order functioning. And I'll take these by lobe. The frontal lobe is in charge of all of your decision making. This is where your personality is. This is where your what psychologists call your moral identity development is basically here. It's where you make choices and rational thought. The parietal cortex is responsible for your sensation of position of body in space. So if you're standing on your hands or you're doing a somersault, this is what enables you to tell that your head is above your feet and your feet are below your head. And this is also responsible for the sensation of touch, feeling on your body, hot, cold, pressure. Your temporal, let's say your occipital lobe, occipital. The occipital lobe is called the visual cortex. It is the smallest of all of the 4 lobes. And although it's the smallest of the 4 lobes, there are more neurons here, which are the brain cells that we'll be talking about today. There are more neurons here in the occipital cortex than on the cortex. So that goes to show that your eyesight is just remarkable and remarkable in its complexity. Your temporal lobe is where your language is processed, as well as your hearing. So I like to think of it like this. You have a left and right hemisphere. So I get my students sometimes to make this shape with their hands right above my eyebrows. So I'm really just a few centimeters away from being able to touch my frontal lobe. And of course, we have the skull to help with that. But we have the frontal lobe, parietal, right, occipital lobe, and then temporal lobe. That's the first supercomputer. The second is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum controls your muscle memory. This is the reason why you learn to walk one time, you learn to ride a bike once, and once you got it, you basically have it. Now there are gifted cerebellums, right? Some people say that they can hop on one foot and chew gum, and rub their head and pat their belly at the same time. I'm not one of those folks. I have a friend, I always tell a story, who played college baseball. He and I played a lot of music together. He learned guitar quicker than anyone I've ever seen. He learned to unicycle. He's just gifted. Some people are very clumsy. You might know of a person who is most likely to trip on flat ground. This is a person who has a cerebellum, maybe not as gifted as an Olympic gymnast. Finally, what I call the third supercomputer is the brainstem. This is responsible for all of your basic life-sustaining functions. Your brainstem is online the minute your heartbeat started beating independently of your mother's. So the heartbeat that's beating from a baby tells us that the brain is talking to the heart, and the central nervous system has wired these together. They're working correctly. And what we're going to learn in psychology, what I think is fascinating, is that even your brainstem can learn through the process of classical conditioning. So I want you to check out this video, and that will help you. It's about 4 minutes, 37 seconds. You can find it in Module 2. Well, we're going to continue with the lecture. And what we're going to do is PowerPoints so that I can explain to you just the complexity and the wonder that is the nervous system. So when we describe the nervous system, all right, the nervous system carries information to and from all parts of the body. You need to know that your brain is constantly talking to all parts of your body, and all parts of your body are talking to your brain. The nervous system is divided into two parts. It's divided into the central and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is basically all of the neurological structures in the brain and spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is all of the structures in the body that are not in the brain and spinal cord. Okay, so what you see here is autonomic and somatic. The word auto and autonomic, this is all your life-sustaining functions. So just putting two and two together, your brainstem, third supercomputer, which keeps you alive, it is the part of the body that is connected with the autonomic nervous system. And this is what we talk about in psychology, because the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system are two systems in the autonomic that either speed you up or slow you down. If you get anxious, your body triggers this process. If you slow down, the body triggers the process as well. So the central nervous system is all the neurological activity in the brain and spinal cord, specifically nerves and the axons, which are cables that are they enable this neurological communication. Neuroscience is the field of studying these neural structures. and more specifically, how they are trained. There's some people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. They go to war, they hear loud noises, and they see their loved ones and their fellow battle buddies die. When they come back, their traumatic memories and traumatic experiences are triggered by the environment. Perhaps they're in a caravan in a war zone and they pass a green road sign, and then all of a sudden an improvised explosive device was detonated. When they come back home, they're on the interstate and maybe their spouse is driving, they pass a green road sign, and all of a sudden they have a flashback and something of a panic attack. And what psychology now can tell us is that our body's alarm system is part of the nervous system, and it is learned. And the things you go through impact your biology. And the root of this learning and the root of these neurological, what we call neural connections or neural pathways, is something called a neuron. So the structure of a neuron is really important in the field of neuroscience. It's the basis of neuroscience. So you have 3 billion of these neurons in your body. They're constantly sending information. 3 parts of a neuron: soma, axon, and dendrites. Soma contains the nucleus of the cell. It keeps the cell alive, decides when to fire. The dendrites receive messages from other cells. And the axons carry information after the soma triggers the firing. So the axons are stretched all over your body. Something I always get my classes to do, if you would raise your pinkies with me, and I want you to wiggle your pinkies. All right, now I want you to think for a second, how fast, from the time I asked you to wiggle your pinkies, if you played along, you did that, how long does it take to make a decision to wiggle your pinkies, and you actually wiggle your pinkies? I mean, it's instantaneous, right? It's almost automatic. But neurology is so cool that neurologists can measure the speed at which a soma fires and the axons carry this information all the way from your motor cortex right here in the parietal lobe and your pinkies. And this message is going as fast as 200 miles an hour. Yeah, I think that's fascinating now that we have these computers that give us imaging and enable us to measure the speed of this communication. Now, this communication is actually called a neural impulse. And the neuron is all or nothing. It's like the firing of a gun. Either it's firing or it's not. It's an electrochemical process. So your neurons constantly are still. Thank goodness that they're not erratic. They're very intentional and purposive. They have a charge of -70 millivolts. When the soma decides that the neuron needs to talk, it fires. And then all of a sudden, there is a rush of energy all the way from the soma down the axon, along through dendrites to the other neurons. This is called the action potential. And after one signal, the neuron rests. It reloads and gets ready for another communication. So you can see this graph. Basically, the way it works is that as information is sent down the axon, negative sodium ions are changed to positive. And this is all happening very quickly. So also, if you'd play along with me, if you see your hands, put your hands, I want you to see how close you can get them together without touching. Now I want you to imagine that this hand is a neuron and this hand is a neuron. The neurons are not actually touching, but there's these microscopic spaces between the neurons. So the picture that you see here in your PowerPoint is actually a real neuron. This is a real photo. And your brain looks as though they're all clumped together. And they are actually not touching. They are microscopic neighbors. So every neuron has about 1,500 different neurons in its locale that it could talk to. So the brain really is so organized. And what facilitates these neural connections is something called a neurotransmitter. So you have these receptor sites, or these microscopic spaces, and you have a synapse, right? The synapse is the small space between neurons. And what makes your brain organized are brain chemicals. You might have heard the phrase of a chemical imbalance. So a chemical imbalance is basically when someone's neurotransmitters are not properly balanced. And so psychology really studies chemical imbalances. And it's really one of the more fascinating areas, in my opinion. So something you'll need to know for the test is that your receptor sites are like locked doors, and neurotransmitters are like keys. So your brain chemistry is so important because these individual brain chemicals are like keys, and that's what organizes all of your behavior. It organizes everything about you. Neurons are either excitatory or inhibitory. That just means that your neurons either tell neurological activity to speed up or slow down. Now here you have a very important picture. Here you have a black widow spider, and that's interesting for this slide because a black widow will, if it has a spider bite, if black widow bites you, there's a rush of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that controls muscle contractions. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter. It is either excitatory or inhibitory. Serotonin is involved in mood, sleep, and appetite. So people who are depressed will report, obviously, low mood, increased sleepiness, increased or decreased appetite. So that just basically says that people who are depressed have a serotonin imbalance oftentimes. And there's a drug classification called SSRI. It stands for Selective Serotonin Reuptake Inhibitor. That is a test item. And an SSRI basically, so if here, let's see, these are your neurons here, especially in your emotional area, the area that affects your mood. And if you're depressed, what an SSRI does is it triggers serotonin to remain around the receptor site. So it opens up communication so that your mood is elevated, your sleep is regulated, and your appetite is regulated. Now, if you're depressed, an SSRI may help symptoms, but it's not going to do anything for the reason why you're depressed. So if you got depressed because of the death of a loved one, obviously taking an SSRI will not bring the loved one back. So my background as a counseling therapist, we were trained really to try to, our value system is let's exhaust all of a person's individual resources before medicine. But in most of my experience counseling, I worked with a psychiatrist. Psychiatrist would prescribe the drugs, nurses administer the drugs, therapists make notation of any drug that's having a problem so the nurse can bring that, relay that information. So it's oftentimes you got to have all systems on the team working well. Some other neurotransmitters that we talk a lot about, dopamine. Dopamine is involved in the control of movement and the sensation of pleasure. More on that in a second. And endorphins. Endorphins are neurotransmitters that are involved in pain relief. Okay, so if we remember that serotonin low serotonin levels are treated with SSRIs. Well, there is a drug that is a dopamine reuptake inhibitor. So dopamine is triggered by this drug, and it basically minimizes reuptake, so your body's not recycling dopamine. The person taking this drug has intense euphoria. And yes, this drug is illegal. This drug is cocaine. But just like an SSRI treats depression because it inhibits reuptake, cocaine does the same thing, but it is highly habit forming. Highly habit forming, and this is the reason. Because here you have cocaine particles which trigger neurological communication. So you have a dopamine dump. What that means is the cocaine triggers the brain the first time a person uses cocaine, so that all of their dopamine is basically released and reuptake is inhibited. And the brain that becomes a cocaine user has a strong likelihood of being chemically dependent, because what happens is, as reuptake is inhibited, your body does not have an endless supply of dopamine. This is why I really challenge young people to evaluate your language. The term crackhead is sometimes said with joke, it's sometimes said very flippantly. You see teenagers posting, calling their friends crackheads and stuff. Hopefully this slide would give us a little bit more empathy. I have people in my life that have been impacted by cocaine use and cocaine addiction. When you understand the science behind drug addiction, it should give us a greater level of sobriety. Okay, so pun intended. Because you understand why chemical addiction is so serious, why chemical dependency is so serious. Because you're actually altering the way brain's working. And once your dopamine is depleted, it takes a person about 7 years. About 7 years after cocaine use stops, it takes a person's brain between 5 and 7 years to really fully gain their ability to enjoy life and to experience pleasure. Because when you laugh, someone tells a joke and you laugh, dopamine is released. But then, because you have a limited supply of dopamine, it is taken back, right? Reuptake, and now enables the recycling of your dopamine. So I hope you learn, be careful with your neurotransmitters, because you have a limited supply of them. So when we look at the central nervous system, we need to know that the brain and spinal cord, again, contain the central nervous system. And so basically this is kind of like what I call the interstate pipeline. All of your neurons are speaking to the body through these axons, and the axons are on this information superhighway that is the spine. If I could break open a spine and show you, not that I would want to do that, but hypothetically, if you were to break open your own spine, you'd see all kinds of gray spongy matter inside of it. And I don't recommend that, because injury to the back and the spine is almost always going to leave a person paralyzed. And that's because the neurons within the spinal cord and the brain weren't designed to have exposure to injury. They have a covering, right? The spine and the skull protect them. Now, the reflex arc, this is the most basic of motor movements. You have sensory neurons or afferent neurons, which notify you in the case of an emergency. Here you have a person sticking their finger in front of on top of a candle. Let's say they're not, we want to assume they're not looking at the candle. This is all, if you step on a piece of glass or you accidentally touch an iron, the reflex arc is in action. So your sensory neurons send an alarm message. Interneurons are what I call U-turn neurons, because they basically turn the signal right around, and the efferent or motor neurons move. And so if you're walking outside and you're barefoot and you step on a piece of glass without really knowing it, your foot is going to jerk up even before you realize what's going on. And so while one signal is going up to your frontal lobe for you to make sense of what's happening, right? Neurons are working even simultaneously. One thing I talk a lot about in my class is the peripheral nervous system. But I also talk about the central nervous system, and specifically its ability to slow you up and to speed you up, and for you to learn in terms of our automatic response, or the autonomic. So one of the important things about the central nervous system is that you have this autonomic nervous system, and it contains the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system. When you are rested, the parasympathetic nervous system is working well. Okay, so your bronchi are constricting. That means you have a slow heart rate, your breathing is deep. If you were to be sleeping right now, right, you notice a person who's sleeping, their chest moves up and down very slowly. This is the parasympathetic nervous system. My students in class start to nod off and fall asleep. Their parasympathetic nervous system is doing its job. But when an emergency happens, if I were to wake up this sleeping student to tell them that they have a pop quiz and their pop quiz is to give a speech, what's going to happen is this person's bronchi are going to dilate. They're going to decrease salivation. Their pupils in their eyes will be dilated. The digestive functions of their stomach will decrease as well, and even their bladder contraction will be inhibited. And so one of the major parts of psychology is teaching people that their autonomic nervous system can be trained. So post-traumatic stress disorder is basically when a person's sympathetic nervous system has been triggered with environmental stimuli because of a traumatic experience. So as we move to the second half of this, I want us to take a look at the structures of the brain, and I will move quickly here. Psychologists get their information through brain imaging. This last October, I lost my dad, who had a long fight with Parkinson's disease. I've been using my dad as an illustration for this slide the entire time I've been teaching. In fact, the very first class I ever taught, my dad got to come visit my class. This was about 14 years ago now. And before his passing, he had a surgery that used electrical stimulation of the brain. So I built this into my lecture. You will have a test item that asks you, what is Parkinson's and how is it treated? You'll need to know Parkinson's is the death of dopamine-producing brain cells. And Parkinson's is treated with medication. Eventually, the medication becomes ineffective because of drug tolerance. Your brain basically gets used to drugs. That's why people who are taking addictive drugs usually need more of a substance over time to have the same level of high. And so as drugs become less effective treating Parkinson's, and as the disease is progressively getting worse, then surgery becomes the next best option for a lot of people. It was for my dad. In this surgery, surgeons will go into the brain and they will electrically use a mild electrical current to stimulate neural activity. So let's say this was my dad's brain. Here you have one axon, and there's a synapse. Here's the other one. And because dopamine is not producing anymore, then my dad and other Parkinson's patients demonstrate a tremor. All right, so towards the end of his life, my dad's hand would tremor constantly. His legs would tremor. And so around 2000, 2005 to 2009, my dad was evaluated. He was seen as a candidate, and somewhere around 2009, he ended up having this surgery. So in this surgery, what they do is they're attaching electrical leads, little jumper cables, to the brain. Now, I ask my students, do you think this hurts? If I were to attach electrical wires to your brain, would it hurt? Even more so if I were to, somebody were to just like get through the skull and touch the brain, would it hurt? And the answer to that question is kind of complex, but the short answer is no, because your brain does not have pain sensors, right? It doesn't have sensory neurons. However, you do have sensory neurons in your scalp. Trust me, if you're bald like me and you get a wasp or a bee sting on your head, it hurts, right? So what's interesting about this, though, is that a Parkinson's patient, when they're asleep, they don't tremor. So in order to have electrical stimulation of the brain through deep brain stimulation, this surgery, the patient has to be awake the entire time. Yeah, that's right. People like my late father had to be fully alive when this surgery takes place. It's almost mind-boggling, getting too close to a pun there, but think about it. Now, how do surgeons get through the skull in order to attach electrical wires to the brain? What they do is they take a long needle and they insert this into the scalp. So they numb this area. Then they also will put a person in stabilize the head. And then they take the equivalent of a power saw. Excuse me if this is graphic, but it's real. It really is done. They enter into the brain area. And so my dad's tremor was in the right hand. Then they enter the left, right? Occipital, the parietal, the motor cortex. Motor cortex is like very close to the border between frontal lobe and parietal lobe. When they go in, then they place the electrical leads. They actually will have neural mapping, where they map the entire area of the brain where they're going. It's fascinating that they have a way of mapping your brain. So this is phenomenal. And I was fortunate to see that my dad succeeded in the surgery. He was very glad he had it, although it was intense. But after electrical leads are connected to the brain, they basically run the wires inside, and then later they come in with another surgery, and then they come in and create kind of like a pacemaker device. So this battery placed in your chest enables, okay, so that they can't do anything about the neurotransmitter that's not working. But this is like a detour. Think of DBS, deep brain stimulation, or electrical stimulation of the brain. Think of it as a rerouting or a detour, creating an electrical signal to trick the brain into thinking that it's working. So it really is just fascinating. Neuroscience is one of the coolest, most cutting edge areas. In EEG, electroencephalogram, this enables brain imagists to identify tumors. CT scan, computed topography or computed tomography. This is a computer-generated X-ray. PET scan, positron emission test. There really is so much that I could share here, but a positron emission test is they actually get the individuals getting the PET scan of the brain to drink radioactive sugar. That sounds kind of weird, but basically you have the sugary substance is tracked. Your brain's primary food is glucose or sugar. And then you take the PET scan, which is of these electrodes on your scalp, right? And it creates this image. And as a psychologist, I find this is my personal favorite. And the reason is because never before could we see the living brain in real time. if I was interested in the effect of playing guitar on a PET scan. Okay, I'm a guitar player, I'm a musician, and I'm interested in PET scans. So if I were to play guitar with a PET scan electrode in real time, well, you would see the brain areas associated with music and creativity would really light up. Many of you have probably had an MRI of different parts of your brain. I have students who get in car wrecks or have concussions. For those people, they're getting an MRI. This is magnetic resonance imaging. So this will be reviewed. The hindbrain is the brainstem and the cerebellum. So the second and third supercomputer. Contains all life-sustaining functions. Here we have the medulla oblongata. This was popularized in the movie The Water Boy. Pons. Pons are associated with brainwave activity, very important for you throughout your life. Cerebellum, this is responsible for coordination and muscle memory. And reticular formation. So all these structures, pons, reticular formation, cerebellum, and medulla, they're all in the brain stem. Now your limbic system are under the cortex. They're involved in emotion, memory, and motivation. So the amygdala is responsible for anger and fear response. The hypothalamus is responsible for all of your drive behaviors. So for instance, thirst, hunger, sleep, the sex drive, all in the hypothalamus. The thalamus is like a switching station. So that is what tells your brain that an incoming sensory signal is hearing or taste or touch. And all the signals in your brain except for smell are located here. And the hippocampus. The hippocampus is responsible for the formation of long-term memories. And if you have a loved one who has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, they have Alzheimer's because in their hippocampus, acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter, is not being formed. There's a breakdown of acetylcholine here, and that's the reason why their memories begin to fade. The corpus callosum is a band of axons. This corpus callosum connects right and left hemisphere. There's a famous scientist who won the Nobel Prize, Roger Sperry, because he theorized that people with intense seizures would be treated by severing the corpus callosum, and it would not really hinder a person's life too much. So based on his research was confirmed. We learned phenomenal information about how the brain works in between hemispheres. I do recommend going on YouTube and searching Roger Sperry split brain research. It's fascinating. But both the left and right hemispheres communicate. And here again, another shot of what we have already learned. You have the occipital lobe governing vision, parietal lobe governing position of body in space, sensation of pain and pressure. The temporal lobe responsible for hearing and language, and the frontal lobe responsible for logic, reason. So your somatosensory area is located just right on the front side of your parietal lobe. This is what enables you to feel things. This pink sliver, the motor cortex, enables you to move. So if I get you to pinch your pinky, the somatosensory system is what enables you to feel this. If I say move your pinky, the motor cortex enables you to move this. and this is happening almost instantaneously. Now for your notes, you might want to take a screenshot. I had a student one time who had Broca's aphasia and had a language disorder. Now she went through extreme speech therapy as a child and was a phenomenal student, and you'd never know that she had a disorder. She actually heard me lecture on this and approached me after class, and we would end up having a good dialogue about this. Her parents went through extreme hard work, driving about an hour and a half one way and back, so 3 hours every day, 6 days a week for about 6 years. And their hard work, just getting her to speech therapy, really paid off because she began to really take off. So take a picture of these. Association areas are those within the lobe of the cortex responsible for coordination and interpretation of information. You got Broca's aphasia, Wernicke's aphasia, and spatial neglect. So check into those things. Very fascinating stuff. So Rogers-Sperry split brain research showed that if severing the corpus callosum, you wouldn't die. Some of my students have suggested. No, you live. You just have kind of a severe blind spot. So this chart shows you what area your right visual field, right, is sent, right, to well, basically check that graph out. The way I usually tell my students is I tell them to do this. I tell them to cover their eyes and to picture that both eyeballs, the left side of both eyeballs is red, the right side of both eyeballs is blue. Now, if you open up your eyes, you can see that the section in blue, right? So the right occipital lobe is sent to the left visual field, right? So that anything I see up here in my left is sent to the the right hemisphere, and vice versa. So Rogers-Sperry basically created a setting where a person couldn't see certain things right in front of them, but if they touched them, they could describe. Very fascinating. So your left hemisphere typically controls the right hand, spoken language, written language, math, logical thought process, and the right hemisphere controls the left hand, nonverbal, visual spatial, music and artistic processing, and emotional thought recognition, processing of things as a whole as well. Now, the last thing that we'll talk about in terms of the biopsychological perspective is the endocrine system. The endocrine system releases hormones into the bloodstream. We have the pituitary gland. This is produces the growth hormone. Pineal gland, which regulates your sleep. The thyroid gland, which regulates your metabolism. The pancreas, which regulates your blood sugar. Gonads, which regulate the pubertal and reproductive process. So the changes that young people go through during puberty are because in the gonads you're secreting the sex hormones. So in males, the sex hormone that is released is testosterone. In females, the sex hormone that is released are estrogens. That's all we have for the biopsychological perspective. Look forward to hearing your responses in the discussion board.